Good morning and welcome to the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting factors report. Today is Friday, October 8th. It's around 9 a.m. We are going to spend the whole day together here. We're going to start by talking about direct funding for student needs. We're going to talk about English language learning grants, and then we're going to talk about trauma. We're in our enabling legislation, and then we're going to talk about budgeting, weighting and rate setting, and sort of a conversation about school and district level budgeting. And then we're going to have a really fun conversation about algebra. And then we're going to take a lunch break, hopefully on time. And then we are going to talk about grade level weights and some new meeting dates. And then we'll have our public comment period. Right now, we only have one person on for public comments. Unlike the room we were in last week, this room, you need to actually have the mic pointed at your mouth in order to speak. And so I hope everyone can share well and remember that when they're talking, unlike just now when I turned away while I was talking. So any questions before we jump in? Great. So first, we are going to hear from Lynn Manley from the Milton Town School District to share with us some of your reflections on English language learning and budgeting for that. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you could identify yourself for the record first.
Sure. My name is Lynn Pacala Manley, and I am from the Milton Town School District. Do you need anything else besides that?
That is quite perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I've prepared some remarks, which I think I sent to Shorsha, and so they should be available for you. First, I'd like to say that we do not receive any EL grants before I start my testimony. Good morning. I'm testifying to give insight into the Legislative Pupil Weighting Task Force on the resources needed to provide evidence-based high-quality instruction for students for whom English is not their home language. They are English learners because their first or home language is not English, but given that the majority of the educational program is primarily offered in English, attaining language proficiency while fulfilling other educational expectations is key to their educational success in Vermont and in the rest of the United States of America. At this point in time, we are not in a position to even consider first language maintenance or enrichment because despite our best efforts, our resources are currently exhausted to provide the most critical services related to second language acquisition and general goal attainment. We continue to invest in these efforts because it is the right thing to do, but not everything is within our power. A little bit about me. I grew up in Danville, Vermont, and attended Danville schools in first grade through graduation from high school. Back then, kindergarten was not public, and I dropped out of private kindergarten. I went on to the University of Vermont, receiving my bachelor's degree in education in 1992. And then in 2007, I was fortunate to earn my master's degree from Johnson State College. In 2016, I completed a certificate of advanced graduate study in school leadership from St. Michael's College. Most recently, in 2020, I completed the Snelling Center for Government's Vermont School Leadership Project. I give you this information to share with you that, compared to my youth, Vermont is becoming even more vibrant, exciting place to grow up. As a Vermonter, the key to my personal success has been an excellent grasp of the English language. The right to learn English is the key to academic and life success in America. Fast forward through my 20 teaching years, I am now a director of teaching and learning at the Milton Town School District. With our proximity to more linguistically diverse areas, such as Winooski, a district receiving primary migration of immigrants, we are receiving what some call the secondary migration. When I began my career as a director of teaching and learning in 2015, there were only 6 designated English learners in our district. Today, there are 44, with the bulk of them being in the lower grades, which suggests that a growing trend that will continue onto the upper grades over time. This may sound like a small number overall for now, but the growth has been quite exponential and the implication for our district is immense. The number will only grow as families establish themselves and move outside of areas with robust public transportation. I'd like to give you some context for the challenges facing school with low incidence English as a second language, ESL. A low incidence school district is one in which the total percent of its English learners is less than 25% of all enrolled students. Milton Town School District is a low incidence school and is also one of the most inclusive schools I know of. Inclusion can be defined as having all students in the least restrictive environment as much as possible, and universalizing instruction and systems to ensure access to all students regardless of difference. We believe that all students have a right to be in a classroom with their grade level peers. At the same time, Milton Elementary School is one of the largest elementary schools in the state of Vermont. We have 6 classrooms at each grade level. Picture 6 kindergarten classrooms, 6 first grade classrooms, and so on. We follow evidence-based practices for placement for both social emotional needs and for the academic needs of our students. This looks like placing students in small clusters so that they are not ELL, English language learner singletons, alone in a classroom. At the same time, they are spread across 6 classrooms. You can imagine the logistical scheduling challenges. This continues through 11th grade, where we have a single ELL student receiving specialized services during study hall, in addition to universal best practices in other courses. Whether we have students who are non-English monolingual or not, i.e. only speak French, we do not believe it is the best practice to separate students out into an EL classroom for part of the day. In short, it is extremely difficult to maintain what is best for students and to achieve any economy of scale. In order to serve students, we feel that it is important to have the expertise of a consistent full-time teacher certified in teaching English as a second language. So we have worked toward that goal. In 2015, we had a 0.6 ELL teacher for an identified 12 students. 2015, sorry. This position was made full-time in 2017 when we had approximately 22 ELL students. In 2020, we added an additional position due to numbers up to 54 ELL students. The growth in ELL students has been exponential in nature, and yet we still do not have the economy of scale, as I mentioned, that high incidence schools have. These teachers must not only work with students across 12 grade levels, but also provide ongoing training to other teachers on best practices within the general education classrooms, monitor registrations, coordinate scheduling, and coordinate and implement one-on-one WIDA testing each spring. In addition, they do extensive family outreach to ensure families are engaged in the school in a meaningful way. This could include visiting places of work to bring forms to help families fill them out. This means personal reminders for field trips. This also means working with our child nutrition team to ensure that all of our students' varying religious freedoms are taken into account. COVID has exacerbated this outreach need as the confusing nature of immediate dismissals, mandatory absences, and testing protocols has created the need for more parent interaction. These 2 full-time EL teachers have a combined cost of $161,000, $98 for salaries and benefits, and then we spend an additional $1,000 for testing supplies. These costs do not include our overall efforts to purchase linguistically and culturally varied books and materials for all classrooms and the library. Additional costs include translation services, interpretation services, and other associated costs. Please keep in mind that one family of primary migration would significantly impact our need for services, because this would entail providing support for both second language acquisition and ideally simultaneous first language maintenance. On any day of the school year, a new American family could move to Milton and influence the composition of our services immensely. We must have contingency plans in place. This means allowing for flexibility in the system. It means planning for growth and complexity beyond simple language acquisition and taking into consideration when budgeting in October for the following school year. As in many situations, pupil weighting and the resulting funding is outdated the minute after it is calculated. Given the complexity of and continuously evolving nature of Vermont students' needs, my recommendations are to 1, reconsider pupil weighting as a sole funding method as the number of pupils can and likely will in our changing world vary widely. It is important to have a stable, flexible EL system in place to ensure that every school can serve all students well using best practices. Perhaps a base amount to take into account the lack of economy of scale in some systems should be considered. 2, either require a basic teaching English as a second language class for every teacher in Vermont, or provide strong incentives for teachers to attain related certifications. For example, some states include a funding differential for districts based on the number of TESOL endorsed teachers. This would decrease the economic pressure on individual systems and is an equitable way to ensure that every school is capable of serving ELL students in a most basic way. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have or find the answers to your questions and get back to you. And again, my name is Lynn Picala Manley.
Thank you so very much. That was really interesting and thorough and helpful. Does anyone have any questions? Representative James.
I do. Just a very basic question. Thanks so much for being here. I was wondering if you could just describe briefly, since our English language learners are not in a dedicated classroom, but rather scattered across many classrooms, and you have 2 full-time teachers, how do the teachers spend their time and work with their students? I'm just curious to know how that works.
Thank you very much for the question. So 90% of our teachers' time is in the classroom with students, pushing in and supporting small groups or a pair, pairing with other students that have like needs. There are linguistic needs that can be similar to other students across the system. We are not in favor of pulling students out of primary instruction because we want to make sure that our students receive what we call a double dip or a triple dip in some cases, and that includes all students that need extra layers of support. So we try to layer on the services. So we do have some small groups that meet during lunch bunches, and they're more like affinity groups to make sure that students are connected to other students like them across the school. We do have a high school student that it would be a little awkward at that age of, 17 to have a teacher push into your classroom and work with just you. So some of this is developmentally appropriateness as well. So we take that into account.
Thanks.
Good morning. I want to clarify one thing. When you say that we should reconsider pupil weighting as a funding method, you're saying that you would advocate something other than just pupil weighting as a funding method for ELL students.
I think that pupil weighting in and of itself does not allow for the base amount needed to begin a robust program. So what many districts are having to do is to, based on their budgets, what they're having to do is try to piece together across 5 or 6 schools or even districts, 0.2, 0.1, 0.3 positions. And that creates a very destabilized base for a strong ELL program. So what you end up with is teachers, I have found in my experience that in the past, if there isn't enough base funding and you're piecing together 0.2 positions, FTEs, people move from job to job to job in that case. And they're always trying to find a full-time position or a position that provides benefits. To be honest. And so what happens is that some of our most vulnerable students will be moving, their teacher will change over and over and over again if we're not able to provide them at least one full-time position. And you could see that pupil weighting wouldn't get many schools up to that point. So we did blend positions for a while. We had a 0.6 and then we blended it with a reading position, and it still creates scheduling difficulties because reading is a whole different ballgame than, say, EL instruction. So it just becomes difficult. So I would advocate for I'm not a financial wizard, but some kind of base amount to allow schools to have that stability, and then pupil weighting perhaps on top of that.
Great, thank you. And I think one of the things we think about, that I certainly think about, is, currently ELL students are actually weighted fairly heavily in that they're counted in two different parts of our equalized pupil formula, or how they're weighted. But I doubt, and you can confirm this for me, I doubt that when you go to budget for ELL costs, you're thinking to yourself, well, we get a higher weight for these students, so therefore we can, apply more funding toward this. Would that be fair to say?
That would be fair to say, yes. I mean, we are constantly striving to do what's best for students. And so we take a look at our budget, and we have students that have a huge range of needs. And so the money is really, as you can imagine, we look at the needs, and then people, the system advocates for the needs. And, you need a very, very strong advocate from within your system to make sure that those funds would truly be set aside for EL students. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
That absolutely makes sense. And am I right that Milton has traditionally sort of struggled to pass budgets on the first vote, or to pass budgets that might meet the needs of all students because of the burden on taxpayers?
I would say yes. Traditionally, we have gone out for second and third votes. Sometimes we have a very, very supportive community in a lot of ways. The finances, I live in Milton, so I can speak to my own property taxes. And they have really risen in incredible amounts since I first moved here in 1994. So I do understand the economic pressures that our town is facing, and that people are facing trying to stay in their homes over time, especially the elderly and people that are from lower income brackets. And I don't know how they do it. I honestly don't. But at the same time, yes, we have had trouble passing budgets. And so that puts pressure on a system to find places to cut, of course, which is a natural economic, that's what happens. And if the system doesn't have an extremely strong advocate for EL students, that may be a place that's seen as a place to cut down to the bare minimum.
Thank you very much.
Not necessarily in my district, but I can imagine that happening. I mean, I'm the advocate, so.
Senator Hardy. Excuse me.
Hi, Lynn. This is Ruth Hardy, and thank you so much for your testimony. It's really, really helpful. And I think you have laid out what we've heard from talking to districts throughout the state as we've been trying to struggle with how to best fund ELL. And we're actually going to be talking about our proposal next, if you're able to stay on. But I know you're also at a conference today, so you're juggling a lot. But I just wanted, I hear that a base funding amount, and then a steady stream of making sure that there's dedicated funding for ELL students, so that the district can provide the robust services that you need for these students up and down K through 12, regardless of what kind of classroom they're in. And I think that's what we're trying to accomplish with our proposal. So I just thank you for your testimony and for, helping us get the information we need to be able to figure out a good way of funding for ELL services. And I'm hoping that you'll be supportive of the direction that we're going, and once you hear all the details. So thank you.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity today. It was nice to meet you all, and enjoy the rest of your day, even though you're in a conference room.
Thanks, you too. We were going to hear a superintendent from another sort of low to medium incidence school district, and he unfortunately can't make it today. And so I'm going to try to reschedule him for our next meeting. But just sort of wanted to name that there were more witnesses on the docket until yesterday. And so next up, we are going to hear from Mark. And Ms. Ganguly, did I pronounce that right? You've gone away.
Yes, you did.
Oh, good. Okay. We are going to not speak with you for quite a few minutes. And so please feel free to turn your camera off and do something else with your time if you would like. Thank you. That is so awkward on Zoom, and I really just keep on trying to not make it awkward and making it more awkward. Mark, you're up. Thank you. Folks, there's a whole lot of documents on this on our website if you want to pull them up.
So good morning, everybody. For the record, I am Mark Peralt from the Joint Fiscal Office. And this morning, I'm here to walk you through a proposal to address the needs of English language learners through a categorical aid program, as opposed to what we have right now. I'll start off with providing a little bit of background that's, I think, mostly going to be a review. I'll also review how we treat English language learners under current law. And then I'll get into the parameters of the proposal, which are pretty straightforward. So as you've heard, in most Vermont schools, English language learner programs are pretty limited in both scale and scope. And we have many districts that have no English language learners at all. The way we try to address this under current law is we provide districts that have English language learners with some additional tax capacity. But as you just heard, that's a very indirect way of going about doing it. And it doesn't actually provide dedicated resources for meeting these kids. On top of that, the UVM report that we've been working from has indicated that the weights that were derived from the models that they worked on were not as reliable as the weights derived from for some of the other factors like grade level and poverty. Using weights to address this need has been problematic, I think. So in other places, categorical aid is often used to address this kind of cost where you have very different levels of need across communities, and in some cases, not at all. And this is a much more direct way of going about trying to address this need across districts. It provides additional money as opposed to providing additional tax capacity. So I just noted in here that federal aid for ELL students that's available to all states is categorical aid. And on the survey that we looked at from the Education Commission on the states a few weeks ago, there are 6 states now that currently provide meet the needs of ELL students through categorical aid as well. So in terms of numbers in Vermont, unedited expenditure numbers indicate that districts are currently spending about $7.8 million for approximately 1,800 English language learners statewide. And that number excludes the federal aid that districts do get. The data that we looked at also indicates that ELL costs reported in the unaudited numbers indicate that there's really wide variation in terms of the amount that districts spend per pupil for ELL language learners. In some cases, it's due to economies of scale. I mean, if you only have 1 or 2 kids, you're going to have a very different per pupil number than a district that has, scale. But it also indicates that the needs are probably not being addressed equitably across districts. There's just a wide range of spending. So a targeted aid program would help ensure that ELL students' needs are being met because it would be providing dedicated money that would actually show up in the district. So you wouldn't have the situation that Representative Conlon you're describing where you have to compete for limited funds. Even though we've tried to address it through the pupil weighting system, no money is earmarked or being directed specifically to those students. So they're basically in competition with all the other needs that a school has. And then the last thing I wanted to mention by way of background is in the UVM report, they did a survey of stakeholders, and stakeholders indicated that new targeted categorical aid programs were preferable to them in certain circumstances, like this, where you have a need that's very different across communities. So Just to review current law, the way we address this now, again, we count English language learners in two parts of our weighted pupil formula. The straightforward way is to provide an additional weight for English language learners of 0.2. But again, as you mentioned, Representative Conlon, we also include English language learners in our measure of poverty. So they're counted in two ways. But again, it's very indirect and it's very not transparent about the money that's going through. So with that said, I'll try to describe the proposal, which is pretty straightforward. The proposal first would provide categorical aid for students in two parts. The first part would be a base grant for every district that has at least one English language learner. That's to address the concern that was just discussed where it's very difficult for a school that has one or two ELL students to actually provide the financial resources and staffing and everything that they need in order to address those. So the base grant in this proposal would be $25,000 for every district with one English language learner. There would then be an additional grant per English language learner for every district of $5,000. So if you were a district that only had one English language learner, your grant would be $30,000. You would get the base grant of $25,000 plus an additional $5,000 for the one student you have. Districts that have larger numbers of English language learners would get that 5,000 multiplied by the total number of English language learners they have. Going forward, the $5,000 per English language learner amount would be indexed so that it would increase annually by the amount of inflation. Third piece is that the proposal would allow broad and flexible use of the grants by districts. So although this money would be earmarked for English language learners, districts would have a lot of flexibility and discretion in terms of how they would use that money so that it could be used for instructional and support personnel, instructional materials, but also family support and education and community outreach and engagement. So although it's earmarked and the money would get used directly for English language learners, I think districts would have some flexibility in how they meet their individual needs, which I think is important given that we have such a wide range of need for the services across districts. And then the last piece of the proposal would just be to repeal the provisions we have in current law so that this need would no longer be addressed specifically through the pupil weighting system, but instead would be addressed directly through a categorical aid program. In terms of costs of the program, this is a rough estimate based on numbers that we have at this point, but there are 69 districts currently that have at least one English language learner in the system. So the base grant, the $25,000 base grant would be about $1.7 million. And then there's about 1,804 English language learners statewide. So the variable grant of $5,000 would be about $9 million. So all told, it would be close to $11 million. That compares to the $7.8 million we're spending right now. So it's not a huge increase, but it would provide all districts some additional resources for them to do it. So
Thank you.
I'll stop here in case there's any questions, but Brianna Parker has also done some analysis on a district by district level that she can share with you.
Do you folks want to look at Brianna's documents from Brianna or ask question? You want to ask a question
Yeah,
first? I
it's a
see
little-
that in your eye.
It's
Go
just,
for it.
it's a little broad. than getting into
Yes.
the weeds of Brianna's stuff. Just marking your proposal, you don't talk about.
My proposal, sorry.
It's the chair's proposal.
In this proposal, there's no mention of how do you, a level of accountability like we do with special education. There's always a report back about how, how to get the money and to make sure that it's being used for its purpose. Would anyone care to comment on that?
Yes, I will. So what are the funds would have to be used for a specific purpose. The school districts do report to the federal government, the districts that receive federal aid. So the reporting would be similar to what districts have for federal. The reason there aren't details in here is because we need to get some testimony in here from AOE about what they would require, but we're trying to make it as low administrative burden as possible, and just have maybe a post audit rather than any kind of application or anything like that. Just really trying to address the concern that school districts are already overwhelmed with administrative work. So getting the funding out there as clean as possible, but we can certainly get more information from AOE and address that at a later time.
And is it fair to say that what we're about to look at will sort of give us a comparison between sort of if you were to apply the current weighting formula to a district with a certain number of ELL students versus what they would get under categorical aid?
I don't think so. I think it's a comparison of what districts have reported that they're spending right now per ELL student and what they would receive under the categorical aid. But Brianna can answer that better than me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And Mark, will we get an idea of what the cost, or what it would look like with the new weighting that the UVM report suggests?
We haven't done that yet. We could, but this gets a little weedy, but the report provided 3 different models to look at. The district level model indicates that there's no relationship between district costs and English language learners. So it's difficult to use that model to do it, but there are other models and we could look at that if you want, but we haven't yet.
Okay. And one other question with regard to the states that use categorical grants. Can you characterize those states? Are they small states? Are they large states? Who's doing it? And what are the other 44 states using?
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look. I don't have it in front of me, but I think that they're generally small states and the amount that's provided is relatively small in terms of categorical aid, but I can pull that information together for you.
Thank you.
Just quick interruption. We are going at our next meeting or the meeting after that, we're going to be able to revisit a table that has what sort of proposed weights would look like and what the new levels are and tax rates if spending stayed the same and all of the questions that I think all feel very pressing for all of us now. Yes, Senator.
Regarding timing, at what point would a decision be made to count the number of ELL students and to allocate funds to them? Is this done on a rolling basis or is it done prior to the beginning of the budget year or at some other time?
Yeah, I can't answer that. Brad probably can answer that. I know that there's a fairly standard way of counting these students that are eligible for ELL services. I don't know the timing of it. Or
In
how
this
that works.
proposal, is there any thought given to influxes of students in the midst of the school year? For example, we're now talking about Afghan refugees coming to Vermont. There's been at least some talk floated federally about the refugees from the southern border awaiting processing, possibly being done in the Swanton sector. And so one of the concerns I have is there's a need when that student arrives, not a year after the student arrives, for the funds and what's necessary to support them. And I'm just wondering if what we're proposing here takes that into account. And if it doesn't yet, then perhaps we should be talking about that.
Sure.
So thank you for that question, Senator. I think that the way that this proposal is structured is similar to the way all of our funding system for school districts work. It's on prior year pupil counts. That's the way our special education funding is also, which is also a categorical aid. And frankly, that's how weights work too. It's on prior year. We did think about the potential for sort of an emergency grant situation. We didn't work through how that might work. Again, I think that might be something we need to ask AOE to see how the capacity to do something like that. But in school district budgeting, if a school district has emergency needs that they have to cover through their budget and they end up going over their budget, the next year's budget sort of takes into account the overage in the prior year budget and calculates that into their next year's budget. So school districts are able to spend over their budget if they need to, and then sort of make it up in the next year. But I do think we could certainly ask AOE about an emergency grant. This funding source would be much much higher than what school districts are able to get right now. So even that would help, alleviate some of these emergency situations, but certainly we can ask AOE about it.
I would just add, it's no different than the situation tuition districts are in right now where, we have an influx of kids that come in after the date that we count kids. They have the deficit spend and then it's addressed in the next year's budget. So,
Mark, I'm experiencing you as muffled and far away.
okay.
I'm sorry. And Senator Brock, I am also very mindful of that as my community is about to have a significant resettlement as well. Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, thank you. As a follow-up on Senator Hooker's point, it would be good not only to see what the 6 states are, but what I think, as she asked, what the other states that have ELL students are doing, which I think
Yeah, I'll
you
take
would
a look
have,
at it.
so.
I know most of them address it just in the general aid formula, so that I can pull that from the
Foundation
formula.
grant. Okay. On the estimate of what is spent now, how was that? Gee, where did you get that number? Because I thought we didn't have that number. But
That number was from Agency of Education.
you just asked them and they told you.
Yeah, and Brianna can address this for you better since she's been working with the data.
Okay. And do you have an estimate on how much the federal, because it says without federal,
Yeah.
Is that-
I think again, Brianna. has
under a
some
million,
information.
over, we don't know, like a range?
We do,
will talk
Brianna.
About
has
that
that.
in her,
Yeah.
it's in her spreadsheet.
Look, and she popped up when we said her name.
Yes, I'm not sure we have it by district, but I think we have the aggregate amount.
That's
We're gonna hold on an answer to that for one moment because I think Representative Beck had a question for Mark.
Just a couple comments. One is to concur with Senator Hardy. I mean, these influxes of people that happen during the school year, they are taken care of in a year-over-year budget process, and that doesn't concern me at all. I'm just going to assume 25,000 and 5,000 are the right numbers. I'm sure at some point somebody will show us how those were derived, but I do have a bit of a concern in a system where the entity that receives the money is also the entity that does identification. Especially when you're talking about these types of numbers, assuming they're the correct numbers, I worry that there might be an explosion of ELL students that are identified, which is fine if they're identified and they need the system. But, if you identify an ELL student when they're in kindergarten, first, second grade, I would expect that there's a time where they kind of phase out of that type of extra. This might create a system where a kid is perpetually identified ELL because of the money that's involved. And so I think that's a detail that I have a concern about and I'm interested in learning more about.
I think, that certainly was a long-standing concern around special education and over-identification there. And we actually, when I was doing some background conversations from this, heard that there were some concerns that English language learning kids were being identified as special ed in order to get special ed funds. And so we had an over-identification drift from that very thing, but in a different direction than you're concerned about. I think it might be helpful to bring back in AOE to talk about how students, there is a technical process for identifying English language learners, and we can have that explained to us again, if that would be helpful.
Sure.
Brianna. Thank you, Mark, very much. And do folks want to hear from Brad after Brianna, or we can just hear from him at some other point? Just want to give him a warning. I don't see anyone. Okay, great. Brianna, you're up with your spreadsheet.
Thank you very much. This is Brianna Parker from the Joint Fiscal Office for the record. And I'll give everyone just a minute to pull up the spreadsheet I put together for you. I think it's called the English Language Learners Categorical Aid Proposal by District. So this is based on the proposal that Mark just described to you. So we can maybe dive in a little bit more to the district level and taking a look at what this looks like. So this is a similar table to what I've put out before. So again, we've got all of the districts and the towns that have students going to those districts as well as all of the English language learners identified and rounded to the nearest student. And then in this next column here, we've got the FY20 English language learner expenditure. And I will say that this has not been audited. This was data that was collected by the Agency of Education. And just taking a look at some of the numbers, you'll see some of them are very small, others are very large. So I just want to caution that this is an estimate. But what we're seeing is a total of about $7.8 million that was spent in FY20 on English language learning students. And then in the next column here, we have the total for the proposed categorical aid program. And so essentially what this is doing is taking the base categorical aid amount of $25,000 for each of the districts that are identified that have at least one student. And so in FY22, that was 69 districts. I have the data on hand for FY20 as well and identified 57 districts. So we did see a little bit of an increase there as time went on. And so from the base categorical aid amount, there's also an additional funding for each English language learning student. And so if you'll see, for example, North Bennington ID right there on the first page, they have one English language learning student. And so they have a grant of $30,000. So that base amount plus their one student. You can compare that to, if you look at Southwest Vermont Union Elementary School District, they have two. So that brings the grant up to $35,000. So a couple of examples there to see how that works. In FY22, we've identified 1,804 ELL students. And like I said, the 69 districts, so that comes to a total of about $10.8 million. Again, just looking at FY20 for comparison, the grand total is about $10.3 million. So you can see it changes a little bit year over year, but we're looking at, ballpark figure about $10 to $11 million. So that is up a little bit from the FY20 expenditure, but not super significantly. And then in addition to what the state provides in funding for ELL students, the federal government also provides funding through the Title III grant, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. And looking at the National Education Agency, I think I'm saying that right, the NEA, provided some data on this and gave us a grand total of about $510,000. And so on July 29th, we had testimony from the AOE that identified 6 school districts, mostly in Chittenden County, that received this funding. You can receive this funding as long as you have enough students that will receive at least $10,000 in funding. So this is not everybody that has ELL students. As we saw, there's 69 districts that have at least one ELL student, and only 6 of them receive federal funding. So it's not a complete program. Not everyone that has ELL students receives that funding. So that's kind of a summary of what we have here. And if there's any questions, I would be happy to address them.
Representative Beck.
Hey, Brianna, 2 questions.
Yes.
One, I'm just looking for outliers in here, and what is going on in Washington County with Twinfield?
Let's see.
Expenses of $363,000, and they would get $40,000 in this grant. Do we know anything about the particulars of that district?
They also only have 3 ELL students.
Right, but they're spending $363,000.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to, if Brad is in the room, he may have a little bit better of a sense on the FY20 expenditure. I'm not sure.
I don't want to take up all the committee's time. I'll catch up with Brad later. Second question.
Wait, Scott, I'm sorry, Representative Beck. I just want to reiterate that this is unaudited data, and there are a couple other outliers that go in the opposite direction and look really funky.
Yeah.
So my guess is it's a coding issue at the district level, that when they're reporting up to AOE, they haven't coded all of their ELL expenses correctly, especially for districts that only have a couple students. and maybe have students going in and out, like one year they have 3 and the next year they have none. They may not be coding their expenses correctly. And so this is really just a data dump from AOE to give us an idea of the scale of what districts are. And so that I would just caution everybody to sort of see that column as, you know, what we have available, but not necessarily accurate.
Mark, do you want to?
Right.
Sorry, you have to stay there. So awkward.
Brianna can correct me, but I also think that some of the data that's reported in here on a district basis was actually reported at the SU level and then prorated back. So some of the noise in there may just be attributable to the fact that the information wasn't reported at the district level initially.
This is
I
true.
believe Brianna, I'm sorry, Brad is also walking towards the microphone.
I like my support team.
Hi, Brianna. Brad James, Leader of Education, because I'm the one who threw this data out here for everybody. This is also the very first year we've had this data. It's a new line of the Uniform Chart of Accounts, and so I don't know how accurate it is. We were asked for it just the other day. It came out. Nobody's had time to sit down and really go through it at all. So I just want people to be aware it's the first time we've seen the data to answer Senator Perch's question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Beck, you had another question.
I do, yeah. And this is more regarding the proposal. Does this proposal envision a district receiving Title III funds for ELL on top of their categorical aid grant? Or would the Title III funds supplant the money that the state sends to the district and the categorical aid sent to the district? So do we add it or we subtract it?
Yeah, so I can speak to any of the questions about the proposal.
Okay.
I don't want to put, so the proposal, just to reiterate what Mark said, it's not JFO's proposal, it's the chair's proposal.
Okay.
So, you know, their staff that did the data analysis for us and the data that we got from AOE came at our request. So, the proposal would allow districts to use both the state funding and the federal Title III funds. None of the districts that receive Title III funds would get more money from the state than what their cost of ELL services are. So it would just be, you know, if they got, if you want to look at the spreadsheet, I'll give you a district example. They're all in Chittenden County.
Okay, so it's on top of, but not to.
Exactly. So
Okay.
Burlington, for example, this $3.3 million that they spend on ELL, that's state funding that's their
District
local and
spending,
state district spending.
Yep.
On top of that, I believe they get about 200,000-ish of the 500,000. And so they would get to spend that on top of the grant. So you can see that right now it'd be calculated at 2.655 million, plus they get a couple $100,000 in federal funding. And that would help support their $3 million in total spending for ELL.
Okay.
Does that make
All right.
sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Representative James,
Thanks. So
you need to be way closer to that.
okay.
Not you, but the mic needs to be closer to you.
So just to clarify, how's that? Is that good?
Great.
So just to clarify, Senator Hardy, no school or district would receive more from the state than they're currently spending. So on the categories or on the columns where you see what they're spending now and what their proposed categorical aid total would be, there are a lot where there's more. So I think I'm not sure if I understood what you.
Right. So why don't I go through sort of the logic of how we got to where we got to, and that might answer some of the questions and the sort of somersaults of mathematics that we did.
Before you do that, I
And
just
I
want
have one
to,
more question.
Brianna's our witness right now.
Right.
Does anyone have any questions for Brianna?
I don't know if Brianna can answer my second question. Should I try?
Sure.
Okay.
let's try.
I was wondering if someone, for example, Brianna, could remind me what that trigger is to pull down the Title III money. I can't remember the threshold.
Yes, so you have to have at least one ELL student in your district, and the grant that you qualify for must be a minimum amount of $10,000. And you must reapply for it each year. Those are the categories that I recall off the top of my head.
I think you have to have a lot more than one student in your district to get the federal Title III money.
Right.
It's a certain percentage of students.
I thought there was
Yeah.
a threshold.
Which
in a
is
lot of our-
$10,000. That's the threshold. Which is more than one student. But Brianna, do you want to explain that in a different way?
Sure,
can you?
I can try. I would also say that I am not the expert on this, but I do know that the minimum grant amount is at least $10,000. So I think that's why there are some districts that don't qualify for it.
Thanks.
Is there a dollar per student? Does the Title III connect it to, is it a formula or is it just a dollar amount per student? ELL.
I think we're gonna hold off on the questions about the title money until we have a witness who can answer title money questions. Thank you. Sorry. Are we finished with questions for Brianna? Sorry to drive us towards such a degree of linearity in this conversation. Thank you very much, Brianna. I appreciate that.
Wait, 1 second.
And are you,
Wait,
Brianna?
Brianna, come back.
Brianna?
Okay.
Hi. I believe that this is your final time being a witness for this committee in the current role that you hold with JFO. And so we would like to all thank you very much for all of your help this summer and your service to the state of Vermont and to the amazing Joint Fiscal Office. And we are sad to see you leave and appreciate your time. And we're going to have a round of applause, I think.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so should I?
Okay, and so now we will hear from Senator Hardy.
Okay, thank you, Representative Kornheiser. So once we did a deep dive into the report and the weights and into the literature and also the testimony about ELL funding, and it became clearer and clearer for a lot of reasons that a categorical aid grant was particularly well suited to meet the needs of ELL students and the school district budgets. We tried to come up with what kind of funding mechanism or formula would work. The first thing that I tried was the weights themselves have a dollar equivalent in the report, and they sort of, if you do the math, and the report does the math for most of the weights to come up with a dollar equivalent. The problem is that ELL, the dollar equivalents don't all pan out very well because the number of ELL students is so concentrated in a very few districts. And then all the rest of the districts that have them have that very few number of students. So the dollar cost equivalent doesn't work as well as other potential weights that are more spread out and more uniform across districts. And in fact, the weight for a school district level is a negative weight for ELL students. So the dollar equivalent for the negative weight is actually negative $4,700. So logically, it makes no sense that we would want to take money away from school districts. So the more you dig into the weights and try to back into a dollar amount, and I worked intensely with Deb Brayton, thank you, to try to work out this math and do all the algebra and try to come up with a number. The proposal or the report actually suggests the regional weight for ELL services may be a better weight for ELL because regionally there are more school districts in New England that have ELL students than in Vermont, and it's sort of a better match. But the regional weight comes up with an enormous amount of money. If you back into the dollar equivalent, it's like $18,000 or $19,000. So the weights just they range from a negative 5,000 to a positive almost 20,000. So they just don't work well for the ELL program. And as we've heard in testimony, school districts are, one, having increasing numbers of ELL students, but don't really have the scale to fund them at a level that is appropriate because of economies of scale. So I started asking school districts throughout the state for their ELL budgets and the number of ELL students. And what we found is there's a huge range in what school districts are budgeting for ELL students and how much they're spending on a per pupil range. And just the few districts that I was able to get data back from, it ranges from $3,100 per pupil to $10,000 per pupil on just the ELL services in districts across the state with varying ranges of numbers of students. The two districts with the most students, Winooski and especially Burlington, that has almost 500 students who receive ELL services. Burlington is about 7,100 per student this year. This is FY22. This data comes from the superintendents who would know their budgets and know their numbers. So looking at all of the different sort of potential ways that we could fund it and what the right number is, there was not really a clear answer to what the right number is. I looked at previous studies that looked at the sort of adequacy of what was required. So that there was an adequacy study done in 2016 in Vermont. And that study actually recommended one ELL student for every 100 students identified as ELL. But one ELL teacher, sorry, for every 100 students, which only a couple districts even have that volume of students in ELL. And so the economies of scale and what you heard from Milton, where they have, 6 kindergarten classes that might have 2 or 3 ELL students in one, and then in 11th grade, just one 11th grade student. There is no way that they could do it with just one teacher or a half-time teacher because they're at 44 students. So the adequacy study also didn't really quite address how much we should budget for ELL. I looked at what other.
Brad, will you leave that open, please? Brad, can you just leave it open?
Thank you. It's just loud.
I know, but there's air.
There's
in
air.
the pandemic, so-
Okay, sorry. The other states that are funding ELL through categorical aids have varying levels, and we can actually get testimony from the Education Commission of the states that is doing an update of their how states fund various things. And I think their update is coming out like this week. And so they're willing to come and testify, and I can ask them to testify specifically on ELL funding if you're interested in what other states are doing. And I believe there's something posted on our website from them that I sent around to all of you at one point. What?
I saw that Representative Beck had a question.
Do you have a question right now, or do you want me to keep?
Well, I do. It's
explaining?
just, but it's pertaining to the proposal. So these numbers, 5,000, 25,000.
Yeah.
And I know we have a lot of variation
Yeah.
between districts and whatnot, but is it the intention in this proposal that the 25,000, 5,000, on a statewide basis would fund 100% of our ELL costs?
No, so
Okay.
so what the logic is so getting to a like per pupil amount that was logical was really difficult. So what I ended up doing after going through lots of different math to try to come up with a number was say, one of the criticisms of our school funding system is that it's super complicated. So I said, hey, simplicity might just be better in this case. And $5,000 is a nice round number. It fits right in the sort of range of what districts are spending right now on a per pupil basis, the 3,100 to 10,000. It's lower than what our biggest districts are spending, but it would still be a significant amount of money. So every district that I surveyed would have at least 50% of their ELL per pupil costs covered by this grant. And some of them would have a significantly more. And the districts that right now are not able to spend a lot of money on ELL, some of our smaller rural districts that ELL is new to them because they're just now getting students, or districts like Milton that is having a huge increase because they're on the sort of outer ring, like the next ring outside of Chittenden County. They will be able to actually increase their budgets, provide more equitable services to ELL students because they will have a dedicated funding source for ELL. So one of the goals was simplicity, round numbers, and another goal was equity, to allow districts that already spend a good amount to have most of it, or at least half of it, supported by the state. And those districts that are not able to spend as much as necessary to provide an equitable education would have actually a boost to be able to increase their budgets for ELL services. And then in order to address the increasing needs, the $5,000 grant would be inflated every year by an inflation rate, which is the standard inflation rate that's based mostly on salaries and benefits, which is the driving factor for educational costs, of course. So there would be an inflation adjustment already in there. And there's a broad range of things that school districts use and consider ELL services. It's not just direct instruction from a teacher. There's also paraprofessionals, there are counselors, there are community, translators, there are community outreach people, there are the cultural liaisons in the bigger districts. And so to be able to fund a really robust system, we wanted to make sure it was as flexible as possible. And then, but they have to spend it on those services. They can't say, well, we're actually going to now spend it on something else. So the question of like the audit or the sort of accountability is still on the table. And, how do we do that without overburdening school districts with a lot of reporting? And that's sort of part of the question. Well, so that is basically how we got to where, another thing, Emily, the $25,000 base grant. So for a district that has one student in it, as Brianna said, they would get $30,000 in the first year. And the logic for the $30,000 is that would be a sufficient amount to hire a part-time teacher to teach that one student. A full teacher's salary and benefits is around 100,000-ish, depending on the district, if you include all the benefits in. And so this would be sufficient amount of money to hire at least a part-time teacher to teach the 1, 2, 3, 4 students that might qualify for ELL services. So that was the logic.
And so in short to you, Representative Beck, it would not provide full funding, but it would provide adequacy for districts that might not have adequacy from their capacity, from their tax capacity. Representative Conlon. And we have just a few more moments on this topic. And I would also encourage folks to look back on the testimony last time we discussed ELL, which feels very long ago to me and might be hard to remember, certainly hard to remember for me. Yes.
Thanks. Senator Hardy, if you didn't know any of the numbers of what the spreadsheet shows, would your 25,000, 5,000 math still, it was sort of done independent of the reality as shown on this spreadsheet. Is that fair to say?
No, I did look at what the districts sent. I got some actual budgets from individual superintendents. And then I requested the data from Brad, who was able to pull it. And as he said, it was the first time they've had that data. So I did sort of look and see, are we in the range? And knowing that these unaudited numbers show about 7.8 million and the grant proposal is around 11 million, it fits with the goal of being able to have increased spending on ELL for the districts that aren't able to spend as much as they need to at this point. So
I only asked just because some of these numbers in here are so wild.
Oh, yeah.
That I assume a more formally audited number is going to be different. I don't know if it's going to be significantly different, but that's why.
Right. I didn't base it on doing the math with those numbers. I mostly use that as a check to say, okay, we're in the range here. Yeah.
Anyone else? It's nice to have you all at the table. I just want to say that it's a lot to look between the screen and the table. What?
Nobody's on the screen.
No, yeah. It's very exciting. So I heard from folks that they want to hear, we need to hear from the Agency of Education about both the federal funding, the title funding, and then some mechanics of how folks are identified as English language learners. If other questions, and then I also heard an interest in seeing a comparison to sort of what the existing tax capacity related to English language weights are. And so if there are any other questions that come up for folks between now and the end of the day or forevermore, please raise them, but we are going to shift gears slightly. Okay, so another arena for possible categorical aid that was named, lightly named, I will say, in the report, and has come up over the years is categorical aid around the idea of trauma and trauma in schools and how schools reckon with trauma. This task force absolutely does not have the capacity to take on a deep dive on this, and other legislative task forces have in the past, but it was named, and so we are addressing it. And I think it would be helpful for us all to get our heads around it, because the issue of sort of, it's an issue that comes up over and over again. And so we are going to hear from the Director of Trauma Prevention and Resilience Development at the Department of Mental Health, who is welcome to join us now. Thank you very much to talk us through some of what these issues look like in schools and what possible interventions might be that a possible grant program might fund. Thank you so much for joining us and your patience while we worked through that previous conversation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So my name is Kaya Ganguly, and as Representative stated, I am the Director of Trauma Prevention and Resilience Development. So when I started thinking about the questions you had, I came up with 3 main points, and from there, feel free to ask me questions, because again, I don't know your baseline of knowledge. So excuse me if I get very basic on certain things.
I think our baseline of knowledge is deeply varied. And so you can make any assumption you want and you will probably be right.
Okay. So first of all, the 2 concepts that go hand in hand are trauma and resilience. When we're talking about trauma, we're talking about events that have a emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual effect on people. They can be significant or they can be smaller. It really depends on how the individual relates. But what we can say is this event makes a significant impact on that person. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from events like that and to thrive. One of the things that you hear people saying all the time is kids are resilient. And to a certain degree, that is true. However, the caveat that I have is kids may look more resilient than they are, because to be truly resilient means you access the trauma you faced, you dealt with it in a healthy manner, and you moved on and you're coping fine. Things are great. For kids who may have been traumatized, but not in a place where they could access how to deal with that trauma, it might be buried and show up later. And it can be much later. So you have kids that look okay on the surface, but truly are not. So trauma comes in a couple of forms. We have simple trauma, which is like one event. Your house burned down. We have complex trauma, where you have a variety of factors that may be hitting you and interacting to create a larger effect. You can have historical and generational trauma, which are 2 ideas that sort of fit together. And they do apply to Vermonters and new Americans who are coming in. Because when you're looking at those 2, one, you're looking at long-term historical events like what's going on with the refugees coming over from from Afghanistan. You're looking at war. That's a huge trauma. Generational trauma happens when a person has experienced trauma and developed unhealthy ways of coping, and they pass that down because they teach the children around them. So it keeps perpetuating. A very good example of that is racial trauma. Overall, what I can say is for us in Vermont, we deal with all of those types of trauma, but the one type of trauma that I am concerned about, especially, is the trauma associated with COVID. And it's not just our children and youth, it's also the adults, because not only were adults traumatized, our lives were turned over and upside down, we also, for many of us, continue to work and witness, especially those who work with people, other people's trauma. So we had our own trauma to deal with, and then we had what we call vicarious trauma, which is being traumatized by witnessing people being undergoing trauma. So, one of my concerns is, as this school year goes on and the next year and the next year, as I said, people push stuff down, we're going to see a surge of mental health issues, of physical health issues, because understand that when you're looking at trauma, it releases a cocktail of hormones, and I'm not going to get really detailed, but it releases a cocktail of hormones in your body that changes how your body reacts. People can have long-term health effects. You could be looking at developing high blood pressure, diabetes, health disease, anxiety, panic attacks, depression, gastrointestinal issues, sleep disturbances. The list continues on and on. I think the big thing that I would say that I'd like you to carry with you is we've done a lot of work in Vermont on training people on trauma, and specifically looking at ACEs, which is adverse childhood events. And as someone who has worked with this for a very long time, I would urge you to consider ways to build resilience. So we're working from a place of strength to address challenges rather than identifying challenges and saying, okay, so this child's been traumatized. That doesn't lead you to a good intervention. So things that we can be doing is training our teachers, training our lunch people, training all school staff, because anyone who interacts with kids could use some skills and understand how to be trauma responsive, understand how to be healing centered, so that they themselves have better health. And so the children and youth they work with have better health. So, and there's a lot of training options out there. The other piece is really building in, and I know a lot of schools are at this point, some social emotional pieces, increasing mental health support, and just really focusing on creating classrooms and schools that are equitable and trauma responsive. So hopefully that's the kind of information you want, but feel free to ask me specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one specific question. When you think about programs for addressing trauma in schools, personally, when I think about it, I get really stuck on the idea of identifying kids who have experienced trauma and having individual interventions versus, and the multiple difficulties and pathologizing that could happen with that. Yep. Versus the idea of taking a whole school approach. And curious about those levels of intervention.
Right. And I do believe in a whole school approach, because I think, here's what I will say. Resilience is something that you can build across a lifespan, which is one reason I talk about adults so much. It doesn't matter what age you are. It's not something that's just innate in you that magically appeared when you were born. Resilience comes from learning coping skills, learning social emotional behaviors, learning how to communicate. And these are all skills that all of our children should have, because everyone was going to face trauma in their life. That's the bottom line. You all sitting there have been traumatized by COVID. I can't even imagine the number of roles you had to take on. You had a regular job, you have a government position. Some of you may have kids and suddenly you became your kid's assistant teacher. You've adjusted to working remote. So all of these things have caused trauma. Our lives have been turned upside down. And then we came and stuff started looking really good in the summer. Everyone saw the light at the end of the tunnel and Delta happened, which for a lot of people shut that light off and pushed them deeper into being traumatized. So I do think a whole school approach works. I will say there are some concerns I have, but I think everyone that I have spoken with that's addressed with some of that are working some of the like whole school approaches, such as PBIS, which is a positive behavioral support program. There are some inherent inequities and racial bias that happens in some of these programs. So I think that's something important to think about when we're doing it. And here's what I tell people, because I know a lot of people talk about ACEs, and I'd mentioned that before. It's a series of adverse childhood events that we know they're traumatic and they lead to poor health outcomes and affect social determinants of health. But the problem is the data that we have there was never gathered to be an assessment tool, and people use it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So, and here's like an easy example. Say you have a kid in school who is struggling and not paying attention, grades aren't good, seems to be all over the place, and someone decides to do an assessment and said, well, this child's father was incarcerated, the mother has a mental health issue. Okay, on the surface, those are two of the adverse childhood events. So you could say, okay, we're dealing with trauma, we need to fix this. And I'm actually coming from a real experience from when I was a school psychologist in Florida. But when I dug deeper into that case, I found a couple things. I talked to the mom, and the father had never been in the child's life. She had no relationship, she didn't know him. So the fact that he was incarcerated didn't have an effect on her. His absence did, the absence of a father, but the incarceration did not. The mother had a mental health diagnosis. However, she was on medication, compliant, did therapy, had case manager support, and never had a break, any type of psychological break since her child had been born. So although she had a mental illness, that mental illness did not affect the child as trauma. And when I did further assessments on the child, it ended up being she was super intelligent, and we ended up changing her schedule because she was bored. So what I'm trying to say is it can be very hard to assess trauma on an individual level. It's something that, our counselors and school psychologists and other mental health professionals in the school can definitely help. So we do higher level individual interventions for kids who are traumatized. But I will say overall right now, we are dealing with a generation of kids who have all been fairly traumatized by COVID. And we're going to have to look at evidence-based practices and methods to build this into the curriculum to support everyone who's involved in education.
Thank you very much.
That was a little long, sorry.
Oh, it was really appreciated. And I think it's a really sort of important note for this task force to remember that we're talking about making all of these changes in the context of a school system that is on a good day deeply traumatized and on a bad day drowning. And I think that's true for all the teachers and kids and administrators in all of our communities. And I think that creates a much higher tension environment that we're working in. And it's also something that we want to think about as we look at implementation and rollout of this work, because the needs are immediate and crushing, and change. We've all had more than enough change in the last, well, actually, I have no idea how many years we've been in the pandemic now. I've lost track of that.
We're about 8 months.
Thank you. I appreciate you acknowledging all of that. Does anyone have any other questions on this before we? Okay. Thank you very, very much for your time and your patience during the previous session. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And I'm really impressed with the amount of thought and work that's going into this committee.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for acknowledging our trauma too. I appreciate it.
I spend time every week doing peer-led support sessions for people so we can review what's happened, give them skills and give quick things you can do to feel better. So I understand.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So Emily, can I just say one thing?
Yes,
about
please. And
This
then we're-
issue.
yeah.
I just want to reiterate what Representative Kornheiser said, is that this was an issue that was brought up by stakeholders in the report. So we wanted to make sure we got some testimony on it and sort of are leaning toward a recommendation of maybe having our education committees talk about this issue more, and because we might not have the capacity right now to come up with what might be the best way forward. But if you have something, an idea, and would like to, bring it to this task force as a specific recommendation, I think we're all ears, but this is an issue that has surfaced. So we wanted to make sure we did due diligence and acknowledging it and including it.
Thank you. And if you have any other questions afterwards, please feel free to have someone reach out to me. And I think your idea of having it worked on as we go is probably a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care. So next up, folks, shifting gears again, we are going to talk about the appropriate levels of budgeting, weighting, and rate setting. We need to make a decision about whether or not we're going to select the school level weights or the district level weights. And so we're going to hear from a few superintendents about how they think about budgeting and the needs of students and dollars available at the district level. And so first up, we have John Alberghini, who's a superintendent from Mount Mansfield Union School District. And there he is.
Hi there.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to actually ask Senator Hardy to chair the next 7 minutes of this conversation.
Hi, Superintendent Alberghini. Thank you for being with us today. This is Ruth Hardy. It's hard for you to see who's talking, I'm sure, with our mask and the video, but why don't you just identify yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Okay, my name is John Alberghini, and I'm the superintendent for the Mount Mansfield Unified Union School District. Just wanted to say thank you to the committee for from what I see as a really thoughtful and sort of methodical approach to the weighting. I really appreciate the fact that you've taken a step back and taken a broad view of all the implications. And I appreciate that, and I want to thank you for that. I also want to quickly apologize because typically when I'm been asked to testify, I would be a little bit more polished and rehearsed and prepared a little bit more. But today you're going to get a very organic testimony from me. Schools right now are being asked to do some unprecedented things right now. I would say that the amount of pressure and stress is greater than I've seen in the 30 years that I've been working in education in Vermont. So I apologize if I'm not as fluid as I normally would be, but I did talk to Senator Hardy, and I have an outline of some things I wanted to talk about. One is just the budgeting process pre-merger and post-merger. Pre our unification as a school district, we had 8 separate school districts that really had different budgeting and goal setting processes for the budget development process. And they had distinct needs. And some of those could be for staffing or student needs, or they lost, 3 or 4 equalized pupils, and they really had to react to that to try to mitigate the influence on the tax rate. Since we have unified, the process has become unified. And so we take a look at what are some overarching district priorities that align with what we call our ends, or our ends policies. And these are significant goals and priorities and initiatives that we want to do to better support students. And our budgeting process revolves around that. So it's really, I would call it strategic. and it's intentional. And we have some flexibility to be able to move resources when we need it from one place to another. What that does is it really influences equity, and it increases our ability to meet the needs of students where they are at, and prioritize based on what we see as the distinct needs of a specific grade level or school, or a group of students. And I think that has really helped us elevate inclusion and equity across all of our schools. It's also brought us closer together, which I think is fundamentally important because we are all in it together. So our administrative team is really looking at how can we support one another to offer a budget that is reasonable, that the community can support, and best serves the needs of our students. So a couple impacts in our budgeting process has been, we've done a really good job, and I think I can say this objectively, of controlling our tax rate. We've had for the last couple of years, our tax rate has been relatively flat. So our school district tax rate, we've had some decreases and minor increases, but if you look at the average, we've been flat. Our enrollment has been pretty static, so we're not losing a bunch of students. We're very fortunate there. So we've been able to, I think, optimize the resources that we have. So we are able to provide what I think is a high quality education for students, and control our tax rate. Prior to the merger, that was really difficult. We'd have 10, sometimes 15% increases in our tax rate for some of our small school districts. And they couldn't really reduce their budget enough to be able to impact that rate. So that's been, I think, had a positive influence for community members in our schools. I'd also say our facilities. Some of our schools just didn't have the money to invest in the facilities. Now we've had a plan. We've been able to reserve, $300,000 to $400,000 a year that we're able to prioritize facility needs and influence preventative maintenance. And down the road, that saves money and also offers a much safer, healthier educational environment for students. And I talked about being able to move resources around and our unified approach. In our budget process, I printed this off. You can't really, I might share it with you, but this is, we have common goals in our budget process. One is closing the opportunity gap, investing in programs, supports and initiatives that support social and emotional learning, mental health and wellness, improving quality, making sure we're investing in professional development around literacy and math proficiency, investing in technology and infrastructure to make sure that we're adequately supporting and resourcing students and families, for that matter, to make sure that they have equal access to our education programs, maintaining efficient and safe educational environments. And then the last is really around innovation, which is realizing some educational opportunities. Some examples are outdoor learning and exploration. Right now we're the only school district in Vermont that I know of that has a Spanish immersion program. We started in one school, and the interest was so great that we have included it at another school. And we currently have about 19 people on the waiting list. Also investing in internships for students, and really trying to invest also in visioning, research and development, and some strategic planning. So, we weren't able to get to some of those pieces that I talked about on the innovation and the strategic planning side in a multi-district system. The last piece I would add is that we've been able also to control our budget. And I can say that, objectively as well, not having really big swings in the increases of our actual overall budget. So that's a little bit on the unification side, trying to be super concise because I know that you have a lot on your plate today, and so do I. But I can take some questions. There are differences from school to school, just to let you know, and I think that's good. That's important. Schools need to have a unique character, and they always have, and they always should. But what I can say is that as far as curriculum, programming, resources, we are much closer to equitable distribution than we were post-merger.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Superintendent Alberghini? Senator Hardy.
Thank you, John. I know you have a lot on your plate. So one of the reasons that we were interested in hearing from you was this conversation about whether we use district level weights or school level weights. And your district is an interesting case study because I believe you were the first district to merge even before Act 46. Is that correct?
Yes, we were, I believe we were the first to unify. It was a modified union for a period of time. But,
right. And what year
yes.
was that? What year did you do the major merger? I know it came in stages, but it was.
I think 2014 was the modified. And then we became completely unified in last year was 2021. It would have been 1920.
20. Okay, so 2019, 2020 was the first year you were fully unified, but you started unification in 2014, 15, or something like that.
Yes.
So the reason that the dates are important is because the report that we're looking at started, the data that the report is based on started in 2010. So that would have been, 5 years before your even initial merger and 10 years before your full merger. And it's fair to say, based on your description and hearing from other school districts as well, that your budgeting process, your way of allocating resources, your attention to equity has changed significantly over that period where you've gone from a bunch of different school districts that are basically one school each to a unified district level budgeting process. Is that right?
Yeah, it's had a really big impact. Yeah, I think around equity, for resources and programming, but also, efficiency and optimizing resources. Because one of the key parts is we want to be able to offer a reasonable budget that our communities can support. And that was really challenging pre-merger for at times. We had some budgets that failed, and it becomes very reactionary. And when you're reacting to a budget failure, generally it's really tough to be thinking about equity. You're thinking about passing a budget. So it's really crisis budgeting.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Would you have one more minute just to, you can say no, could I give you a little bit of feedback on the weighting study or just some thoughts I have? You can certainly say no.
Yes. No, you gave us your time. We are giving you our time. We are here together.
So what I would just like to share is that I know there's a lot that needs to be done on the weighting study or may be done. But I just want you to know that the weighting study and the scenario that was preferred in the study would be, this is no hyperbole, catastrophic for our school district. For us to be able to manage a 30-cent increase would be, I can't even imagine it. And that is not, me being over exaggerating at all. A 5-cent increase without us doing anything or making any program or staffing changes would be huge. So what I'm hoping is that there are not winners and losers, but a lot of winners, and that we're not pushing people down, but we're bringing everybody up to the same level. And one of the really encouraging parts of the communication, and I think the conversation around the weighting study, is everybody wants to ensure that educational funding is equitable in Vermont. And that, that I'm sure that encourages people to move to the state, because that's a commitment that I think you folks, the legislature, and every school leader and teacher I've talked with in Vermont, we all support that. And we're concerned that, that what the impact will be for some districts comparatively. And I would ask that the committee, just take a look at all of the variables that influence education funding, and including consolidated federal grants, and consider, the possibility of categorical grants, because that is a way to really prioritize need and distribute funding to make sure it goes where the greatest need is. And I thank you for that additional time.
Thank you. And I really appreciate so much what you said about the idea of making sure that this renewed focus on equity can mean that perhaps all of our kids can be winners in our school systems, and all the systems can be too. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Superintendent Bonesteel, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is now yours to share your thoughts specifically on the school versus district level budgeting and weighting. And then also, I believe you have something to share with us about English language learning as well.
Yeah, just some quick information for you, just from our budgetary standpoint. And I thank John for saying what he did. As I'm a parent in his district, and I wouldn't really like a 30-cent tax increase either. So thank you for inviting me to testify today. I am superintendent of schools for Montpelier Roxbury Public Schools. And my former role as a director of curriculum and instruction for what is now Missisquoi Valley School District. It was Franklin Northwest when I was there. Will also influence a little bit of this testimony. Mrps, my school district, currently has 40 students in need of English language services, representing 4% of our student population. We employ 2.6 FTE in teachers for our current caseload, to the expense of $210,000 a year for fiscal year 22. Our population of English language learners is really interesting because it fluctuates. National Life Group is in Montpelier, and they must have a hiring program. Well, I haven't spoken with them directly. They must have some sort of hiring program to bring families from abroad, particularly from places like India, for what appears to be short durations. It's usually 2 to 3 years. And the families have younger children. So the bulk of our EL population is centered in our kindergarten through grade 3s, which is really a fascinating and beautiful thing at Union Elementary School, but highly influential. So as I understand the brainstorming around the weighting study, the committee is considering a grant type mechanism in addition to per pupil rates for English language learners. We have a relatively small economy of scale at Montpelier Roxbury with just the 40 students. So I believe that this grant type of mechanism would make sense for my district. The tax implications of a simple weight for our small numbers would not likely come close to assisting us in our yearly costs to service these students. So if it was a grant and then a weight on top of that, I think it speaks to what John was just so eloquently saying at the end of his testimony. Should the committee go in the direction of a grant, we do have some questions and concerns to consider. I spoke with my business manager at length about this earlier in the week. The current Title III grant for English language learners is not sufficient to cover the costs, and this is where my experience in Franklin Northwest comes in play, as I was in control of the Title III opportunity. And we have a very small population of English language learners up there, so it was about $3,000. There was a considerable amount of bureaucratic loopholes that had to be accomplished in order to get that small amount of money, and it went nowhere near to cover the costs of our English language part-time teacher up there at that time. So if there is a grant process that's put in place, please, 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 especially now for districts when there's so much going on, we would request that the process for obtaining any of that funding be as simple as possible, and not have a lot of loopholes and paperwork that has to go with it. We would also like to put forth the idea of a reimbursement for costs associated with EL services that could come in the form of a grant. This could be a percentage of total cost for services once that number is known within the fiscal year. That would be something easy to plan for and budget for across the school year. I've also been asked to share the MRPS process for budgeting. We do not create our budget in any way through individual schools, but solely as a district. And the reasons for doing that are multifaceted. We have a pre-K through 12 continuum in regards to programming and curriculum development. That's a requirement according to the EQS, Educational Quality Standards. So we want to ensure that alignment. We value visioning as a district, so our students and caregivers have a clear path to graduation. We have one idea for what we want for our graduates, and we can't have an inequitable funding formula by doing it through schools, because we need to be thinking in lines of a district. We create a district-wide continuous improvement plan as required by the Agency of Education. We center this on what we call our theories of growth, and that's a district-wide theory of growth. Then each school thinks, using their data, thinks where they are within those areas of growth, and they make differentiated improvement plans, always centered on the district's vision for growth. This helps the economy of scale for professional development, common language, and staffing needs as we're thinking about budgeting. District-wide policies such as class size also dictate our district's approach to budgeting based on staffing needs. And English language and special education services are a district responsibility, not a school level responsibility. Special education moved to the district level by law in the school year 2015-2016, and special education is one of the largest drivers in our budget. So that's my testimony for today. I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have, or attempt to anyway.
Thank you very much. Questions from folks? I think it was perfectly comprehensive in all ways. And so we have no questions of you. And I thank you very much for your time.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So folks, we're going to take a 7-minute break. And during that 7-minute break, I would ask you to prepare yourselves, because we are genuinely going to talk about algebra for the next hour before lunch. And it's really important algebra, but it's algebra. And so prepare yourself for 7 minutes for a really